Terrorism is, in the broadest sense, the use of intentional violence to achieve political aims. It is used in this regard primarily to refer to violence during peacetime or in the context of war against non-combatants. The terms terrorist and terrorism originated during the French Revolution of the late 18th century but gained mainstream popularity in the 1970s during the conflicts of Northern Ireland, the Basque Country and Palestine. The increased use of suicide attacks from the 1980s onwards was typified by the September 11th attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. in 2001. There are various different definitions of terrorism, with no universal agreement about it. Terrorism is a charged term. It is often used with the connotation of something that is morally wrong. Governments and non-state groups use the term to abuse or denounce opposing groups. Varied political organizations have been accused of using terrorism to achieve their objectives. These include right-wing and left-wing political organizations, nationalist groups, religious groups, revolutionaries and ruling governments. Legislation declaring terrorism a crime has been adopted in many states. When terrorism is perpetrated by nation-states, it is not considered terrorism by the state conducting it, making legality a largely gray area issue. There is no consensus as to whether or not terrorism should be regarded as a war crime. The Global Terrorism Database, maintained by the University of Maryland, College Park, has recorded more than 61,000 incidents of non-state terrorism, resulting in at least 140,000 deaths between 2000 and 2014. Etymologically, the word terror is derived from the Latin verb tercere, which later becomes terrere. The latter form appears in European languages as early as the 12th century. Its first known use in French is the word terrible in 1160. By 1356 the word terreur is in use. Terreur is the origin of the Middle English term terror, which later becomes the modern word terror. The term terroriste, meaning terrorist, is first used in 1794 by the French philosopher François-Noël Babeuf, who denounces Maximilien Robespierre's Jacobin regime as a dictatorship. In the years leading up to what became known as the Reign of Terror, the Brunswick Manifesto threatened Paris with an exemplary, never-to-be-forgotten vengeance. The city would be subjected to military punishment and total destruction if the royal family was harmed. But this only increased the revolution's will to abolish the monarchy. Some writers' attitudes about French Revolution grew less favorable after the French monarchy was abolished in 1792. During the Reign of Terror, which began in July 1793 and lasted 13 months, Paris was governed by the Committee of Public Safety, who oversaw a regime of mass executions and public purges. Prior to the French Revolution, ancient philosophers wrote about tyrannicide, as tyranny was seen as the greatest political threat to Greco-Roman civilization. Medieval philosophers were similarly occupied with the concept of tyranny, though the analysis of some theologians like Thomas Aquinas drew a distinction between usurpers, who could be killed by anyone, and legitimate rulers who abused their power. The latter, in Aquinas' view, could only be punished by a public authority. John of Salisbury was the first medieval Christian scholar to defend tyrannicide. Most scholars today trace the origins of the modern tactic of terrorism to the Jewish sicarii, zealots who attacked Romans and Jews in 1st century Palestine. They follow its development from the Persian order of assassins through to 19th century anarchists. The Reign of Terror is usually regarded as an issue of etymology. The term terrorism has generally been used to describe violence by non-state actors rather than government violence since the 19th century anarchist movement. In December 1795, Edmund Burke used the word terrorists in a description of the new French government called Directory. At length, after a terrible struggle, the troops prevailed over the citizens. To secure them further, they have a strong corps of irregulars, ready armed. Thousands of those hellhounds called terrorists, whom they had shut up in prison on their last revolution, as the satellites of tyranny, are let loose on the people. The terms terrorism and terrorist gained renewed currency in the 1970s as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Northern Ireland conflict, the Basque conflict, and the operations of groups such as the Red Army faction. Leila Khaled was described as a terrorist in a 1970 issue of Life magazine. A number of books on terrorism were published in the 1970s. The topic came further to the fore after the 1983 Beirut barracks bombings and again after the 2001 September 11 attacks and the 2002 Bali bombings. There are over 109 different definitions of terrorism. American political philosopher Michael Walzer in 2002 wrote, "Terrorism is the